Place in Manchester. This follows, you'll remember, that video that emerged showing a officer being filmed kicking and stamping on a man's head at the airport last month. Now, this is the solicitor for the two men who were involved and their mother, Amar Anwar. He is speaking. Let's have a listen to what he is saying.
Justify alleged police violence. As far as we are aware, there have been no proactive attempts by the GMP to monitor or to investigate the further hate crimes perpetrated against this family. I have now spoken to Catherine Bates, the Regional Director for the IOPC, with regards to lodging a formal complaint against officers from Greater Manchester Police. We intend in the coming weeks to meet with the Director, but also to seek a meeting with the Mayor, Andy Burnham, if he is actually interested in the context. I will firstly set out today some of the context of what the family alleges happened that day, followed by a list of concerns and requests they wish to make public. The deliberate attempt by some within Greater Manchester Police, or so-called police sources, to present a version of events to the media in the immediate aftermath and then to claim publicly that they're cooperating with the IOPC investigation is deeply unhelpful and can be seen as nothing more than a deliberate and cynical attempt to manipulate and mould a narrative of events and untruths. The family has many serving police officers and believe the actions of these officers do not represent their many colleagues who do a difficult job day in, day out. The family wish to put on record that if the two young men sat next to me and seen on video and stand accused of criminality, their family fully support that they must face robust, due legal process. But the family also wish to state that they know more than many other families that the police play a crucial role in our society and police with the consent of the people, and that it is precisely why, when they get it so badly wrong, that they must be held to account. Equally, when they get it right, the police should be praised, and the family wish to place on record their thanks to the police, who for days have had to face right-wing racist thugs causing violent disorder and spreading fear across England. But it will be clear to many who have watched the horrific violence over the last few days that despite repeated attempts to harm police officers, despite the grotesque and often deadly violence they faced, the missiles, the punches thrown, the arson, the wanton violence they were subjected to, that police officers have not been provoked and taken the law into their own hands. In our democracy, we have the right to expect that those in uniform will not act as thugs and will act within the law, and that any force used must be reasonable, legitimate and proportionate. The two young men sat here today, along with their mother and family, are left devastated and traumatised by the incident at Manchester Airport. Despite the clear attempt by some to place disinformation in the media and on social media, the young men sat next to me do not have a single criminal conviction, not even a speeding ticket. In fact, members of the family are serving police officers with Greater Manchester Police and other members of the family in other areas of the country. And Ahmad himself has undergone an interview process to join the GMP. Today is about setting the record straight and issuing a warning to Greater Manchester Police that leaking or using so-called police sources to justify alleged criminality by their officers can only be seen as a deliberate attempt to interfere with the IOPC investigation. I want to start now with what sparked the incident, something that we have heard nothing about to date. Mrs. Shamim Akhtar was travelling back from a holiday in Pakistan. She was feeling unwell on the plane and as a result used the empty seat next to her to be able to sit more comfortably. Shortly after making use of the seat, she could hear a male muttering in the row behind her. At first she paid no attention, but then the male went out of his way over the course of the next several hours to subject her to a tirade of alleged racial abuse. He repeatedly called her a bitch, he used the P word and referred to her as a P-bitch. Mrs. Akhtar, for several hours of the flight, was scared the male was going to become physical and assault her. Despite her appeals To the Qatar Airlines cabin crew, they did nothing to intervene. She appealed to the male to calm down, but he refused to listen, despite telling him she was unwell. The male began to call her a bitch again, and the male stood up behind her. He was towering over her and hurling abuse. It was a mixture of abuse in English and in Arabic. At this point, she became increasingly frightened and intimidated. He was over 6 foot tall and was of large build. The male's wife intervened and told him to stop and asked him to sit down. However, the male continued, and his children were also ridiculing Mrs. Akhtar. Even though she was feeling extremely unwell, she forced herself up and walked to the rear of the plane looking for a seat. She sat down at the back on a random seat, however was told to move pretty much straight away as somebody else was assigned to the seat. She had no choice but to come back to a seat and sit down, and the abuse continued for several hours. The male continued to intimidate her by shouting racist abuse and by being a bully. Once the flight landed, Mrs. Akhtar says she walked off the plane, and walking towards the baggage claim area, she felt something hit her hand luggage and hitting her behind. She looked back and saw the male standing behind her, and from what she could make out, he was using his hand luggage to repeatedly bump into her. At that point, Mrs. Akhtar began to cry. She was extremely traumatized. She was scared. She was upset and stressed, and she even collected the wrong suitcase, which she did not realize until she eventually got home that evening. As soon as she exited at the arrivals, she saw her 2 sons and a six-year-old grandson waiting for her. She broke down into tears and told them that what happened to her over the last several hours, and Mrs. Akhtar's sons questioned her, which was Fahir and Ahmad, as to what had happened and who this male was. She told her sons that the cabin crew had failed to assist her. She wanted to leave, but when they walked past Starbucks, she noticed the male in question, and Mrs. Akhtar froze. Both her sons approached the male and questioned him regarding the abuse. The male was rude and proceeded to laugh in her son's face, and an altercation took place. Following this, the family left Starbucks and headed towards the car park. When they got to the car park, Fahir was paying for the parking. I will summarise some of the details because of the ongoing investigation, but police officers, who were 2 females and a male, approached Fahir, and then, without identifying themselves, immediately grabbed Fahir by the wrist. And I have seen, and many of you will have seen, the footage that has been broadcast by the Manchester Evening News, some of it heavily pixelated, but the context that the family wishes to provide is that if you watch closely the footage, that Fahir is immediately grabbed by the wrist, as can be seen on the CCTV. The male officer proceeds to grab Fahir by the neck, and it is alleged that he hits Fahir's head into the ticket machine, at which point the other son, Ahmad, asked the police officer to move his hand from Fahir's neck, as he was not resisting arrest. Ahmad and his mother, Shamim, were shocked at the unnecessary aggression and alleged violence shown from the start. There was no immediate attempt to speak to Fahir, to ask him to step aside, to caution him, or to simply say, "Can we speak to you for a second?" The family appreciates you have seen leaked footage with pixelation of the top of vital events as they unfold. However, this is what the context of what took place. When Ahmad asked the police officer to remove his neck hold, it is alleged by him and his mother and others that the male officer then proceeded to punch Ahmad twice in the side of his head, at which point Ahmad falls onto the ground. Mrs. Akhtar also falls to the ground as the officer pulls her and Ahmad down due to the fact that she was holding Ahmad from behind. The officer, whilst punching Ahmad, pushes her to the ground, and she looked up and saw the officer firing his taser at Ahmad, at which point she screamed, "They've killed my son," in Urdu. And as you can see from the CCTV, pandemonium breaks loose at that point. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar, seeing Fahir running towards the officer, and saw that he is also tasered from behind and lands face first, at which point the officer falls down with him. Mrs. Akhtar then goes to Fahir and can be seen leaning over her son as he lies motionless on the ground. The taser that is used is a prohibited firearm and licensed by police officers to use, and it can emit up to 50,000 volts of electricity. At no point do you see on the video Fahir reaching for any officer's firearms, as is later claimed in the immediate press release from the GMP, nor is he in fact doing anything other than lying motionless face down. It is at this point, as the officer stands up, he proceeds to run and kick Fahir in the face. Mrs. Akhtar then tried to pull her son's head away, and as the officer then attempts to stamp on his head, as can be seen in the graphic video at this point, both brothers are compliant. Fahir is incapacitated. His brother is sat some distance behind on a seat with his hands on his head, with officers keeping him under control. The officer then proceeds to lift his foot up and appears to stamp down on Fahir's head. Mrs. Akhtar states that she attempted to pull her son's head away as she thought the officer could have killed her son at this point. She genuinely believed at this point that her son was dying as he was limp and unresponsive due to being tasered. The male is alleged, as seen in the video, then kneels down, the male officer, kneels down on Fahir, placing his knee on his back whilst he is still limp, and then looks up straight at Mrs. Akhtar whilst he has his knee on Fahir's back and he is not moving. At this point, it is alleged that the male officer still has his taser drawn, then using his right hand, it is alleged, he strikes Mrs. Akhtar directly in the face using his taser as a weapon. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar never, prior to this or during that point, is presenting any threat to any police officer. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar screams. As she holds her face, she is terrified that she would now be subjected to the same violence as she alleges her son were. This is the bruising that Mrs. Akhtar had on her face. You'll get copies of this at the end of the press conference. But this is the bruising, some of which you can still see on Mrs. Akhtar's face today. She was left bleeding from below her eye. This is what Mrs. Akhtar alleged she was subjected to, and at no point did any officer approach Mrs. Akhtar to check on her well-being or her welfare. At no point did anybody seek to get medical assistance for Mrs. Akhtar, and as she screamed, as I state, she thought that she would now face the same violence as her two sons did. Mrs. Akhtar then held her face, as well as holding onto her son Fahir. She noticed the officer walked off behind her, and she was scared that this officer would attack her from behind. She looked back and noticed that he then pointed his taser at her other son Ahmad, who was sat down with his hands on his head and was complying. Even though she had been attacked, she struggled and stood up. And so the same officer that had allegedly attacked her and her son Fahir then proceeded to kick her son Ahmad and drag him down on the floor and use his taser as a weapon to hit her son on his head. Another officer then sat on top of Ahmad and pinned his head down to the floor and proceeded to threaten him. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar just stood up between her sons who are lying on the floor, and at this point she can hear a 6-year-old grandson crying and her son Ahmad telling her to go to his nephew. Mrs. Akhtar touches her face and noticed she was bleeding from a cheek underneath her left eye. She was stood there and didn't want to leave her sons as she was genuinely feared for their lives. And she then noticed the officer that kicked Fahir in the head go over and she tells him to stop. At this point, the officer tells her to step back, and then a female officer pushes her away as she is moving away. Another female officer then comes behind her and pushes her back, pushing her back away again. She was left dazed, she was crying, she was disoriented, but noticed the two officers with Ahmad roll him over onto his front, and at this point he was handcuffed from the rear, and now they were kneeling on his chest. The officer then grabbed Ahmad by the neck and pushed his head into the floor before then getting him up and taking him away. She then sees the other officer lift Fahir and also take him away.
So there we have the solicitor Anwar talking about that incident that happened at Manchester